Okay. Can you hear me and see the slides again?
Yes.
Okay.
I can't see this. Okay, there we go.
Okay. So the reason I am doing a different recording is because I'm going to use this recording in future completely online classes. In the Zoom recording would have your names, your faces, your voices, all of that. This other recording won't have any of that. And so I'm doing two recordings here, which is why I had to do some switcheroos. But what matters to you is I will get things online for you. And if you're watching this in a future semester, that explains why you may hear it sounds like there's voices in the background. I'm talking to an actual live class, and I'll try, if they ask me a question, I'll try to repeat the question so that you can hear it. So this is the first lecture of the semester. This is going to be a very basic introduction and some vocabulary that we're going to learn. And the most basic vocabulary that we need to worry about is the name of the course. Right, this is anatomy and physiology. And so what is anatomy and physiology? So anatomy is form. Okay, we think of anatomy and physiology as form and function. Form is going to be what are parts called, and well, what are they called and where are they? Okay, it's like looking at an engine and saying these are the parts of this engine, and if I wanted to assemble an engine, this is how I would put it together. Now, just because you can put an engine together and you can name the parts of that engine, that doesn't mean that you know how an engine works, right? And so anatomy is the parts, physiology is how things work. This is the function. The form and the function is anatomy and physiology. Physiology is how things work. If you know how an internal combustion engine works, and don't worry, I am not requiring you how to do that, but there are multiple steps involved here. And in order to get the engine to run, all of these things have to happen. And so if an engine stops working, knowing where the cylinder is not going to be helpful to you. But if you know how the cylinder works or what its function is, and what is the function of the piston and the spark plug, and where does the exhaust go, where does the gas come in, that's going to help you figure out how to fix that. And so we have some of these just little review questions sprinkled throughout the lectures. And so this is not a quiz or anything like that. This is just for you to read the question and see if you know what the answer is. And so does anybody think they know the answer to this question?
It's B, the anatomy.
Correct. And so the structures are the parts, right? Yeah. So everybody was putting in B. It was blinking on me saying that people were putting the answer in chat. So yes, the answer is B, anatomy. Next thing we need to look at is what we call the levels of organization. And so, actually, let me ask you, on my screen, on the slides, at the very top, there's a bar saying you are screen sharing, and there's a list of video and participants and things like that. Can you see that? Okay. Okay. That's good, because it's blocking the top part of the slide. I just wanted to make sure that you couldn't see that. Okay. So when we look at an organism is us, right? And so this doesn't apply to just humans. This is all plants, this particular pyramid doesn't apply to plants, but all animals. Okay? An organism is the entire person, the entire animal. And so that's the bottom of that pyramid. That's the largest level of organization that we look at. If we take that organism, we can break it down into parts. And those are organ systems. Each organ system has a function, and multiple organ systems come together to complete all of the functions needed for an organism to live. An example, what we're looking at here, is the urinary tract system or the renal system. The kidneys filter the blood to create urine, which goes through the ureter into the bladder and out the urethra. That is the renal system. Or think the digestive system. We have the stomach and the intestines and all that goes along with that. It serves the purpose of getting nutrients from our food into our body. An organ system is required to have at least 2 organs. An organ system has to have at least 2 organs. An organ is a part of an organ system that serves a specific purpose out of that large purpose. And so let's go back to the digestive system. I think people have a better understanding of how that works rather than the renal system. So in the digestive system, we said its function was to get nutrients out of food. But the stomach has a different role in that than the intestine does. And so each organ plays a specific role in a larger function. And an organ is made up of at least 2 tissues. A tissue is a type of cell. And that type of a cell has a very specific function that makes up that organ. For example, think of the stomach. The stomach has muscle in there because it has to squeeze our food, right? But there's also tissue in there that secretes acid. That's a different type of tissue. But they're both involved in the digestion and the breakdown of the food. Now, we said that a tissue is made up of cells of a specific type. Now, cells are the smallest level of this level of organization where things are alive. A cell is the smallest unit of life. And in that cell are other parts. There's parts of a cell, and we'll learn all about that cellular level in its own lecture coming up in a couple weeks. But there are things like the nucleus. That's an organelle. An organelle is one of the parts of a cell. And there's also water. There's lots and lots of water in a cell. So that is a cell. And a cell is a collection of molecules. A molecule is chemistry. At that point, you're working in chemistry. And our second lecture, in fact, is on chemistry next week. A molecule is a collection of atoms. Atoms are the smallest unit of matter. That's what's on the periodic table. And we'll learn about that next week. And so the atoms make up molecules. And then we can take a bunch of different molecules, put them together, and make a cell. If we take a whole bunch of similar cells and put them together, we have tissue. And if we take multiple types of tissues and put those together, we have an organ. If we take multiple organs that have somewhat related functions, we have an organ system. And if we take multiple organ systems and put those together, we have an organism. And so you can look at this pyramid either way. For some people, it'll make more sense to start at the bottom and work smaller and smaller and smaller. For other people, it will make more sense to start at the top, the smallest, and build and get bigger and bigger and bigger. Are there any questions about the levels of organization? Okay, so here is a question for you to think about. And so just let's see if you can get the right answer. You don't have to answer it at all, but you can put your answer into the chat. You can say it. You can do whatever you want.
D.
So somebody said D, and so the question is smallest to largest. And so atom is the smallest thing. You take atoms, put them together to make molecules, put those molecules together to make cells, and cells come together to make tissue. So yes, D is correct. A, B, and C take those same things and put them in the wrong order. So we have 12 organ systems. Some textbooks will say there are 12. Some will say there are 11. Now that seems like a very big controversy, but it's really not. We'll see why on the next slide. Our textbook says there is 12. And so the different organ systems will make up most of the lectures in this class, and then the organ systems we don't cover in this class, you will cover in 2086 next semester or whenever you take that. And so for this particular lecture, what you're required to know is what the 12 organ systems are. And then in later days, we'll talk more about the integumentary system and the skeletal system and the muscular system and things like that. But we'll just quickly go through the 12 different organ systems. Number one is the integumentary system, and this is one that you certainly know about, but you may have never heard of. This is the skin and the things that go with the skin, which includes the skin, the hair, and the nails. So that is your integumentary system. Then there is the skeletal system, which is there are bones and our joints. The muscular system, which is the muscles, but also the tendons that connect muscles together. Our nervous system, which is our brain, our spinal cord, all of the other nerves that are involved in feeling and seeing and our senses and all of that. The endocrine system is another one that you probably or possibly don't know about, even though you do know about it. The endocrine system is our chemical messaging system. These are all of our hormones and our glands. Hormones, we'll learn about next week, are chemical messengers. They're little molecules that get made and they get put into the bloodstream. They go all over the body, and then they tell different parts of the body to respond in different ways. So some examples of things involved in the endocrine system are the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, the pancreas, which makes insulin, the adrenal glands, which make adrenaline, and our reproductive organs, the testes and the ovaries. Testes make testosterone, ovaries make estrogen. Those are both hormones. And so testes and ovaries, even though they're going to be in the reproductive system, in the next slide, they are also part of the endocrine system. Cardiovascular is the heart and the blood vessels. We have the lymphatic system, which is yet another one that you may not have even known existed. In fact, the lymphatic system is one you may not know existed. You've certainly heard of lymph nodes, but you probably have no idea what they do. And you probably don't know that there are lymphatic vessels. Look at that picture. It looks like the cardiovascular system, right? You have all these vessels running all over your body as part of the lymphatic system. They're lymphatic vessels, and most people don't even know they exist. We're not going to talk about the lymphatic system in this class. That's 2086. But its biggest function is the immune system is part of the lymphatic system. And the lymphatic system essentially works as the sewer lines for the cardiovascular or the circulatory system. Think of it like a house. You have pressure water that comes to a faucet, and then once it comes out of the faucet, it goes in down the drain through your sewer pipes and then goes back to the water treatment plant, right? That's what these lymphatic vessels do. They take the water that leaks out of the cardiovascular system, collects it, and returns it back to the heart so that it goes back into the cardiovascular system. Next, we have the respiratory system, which is more or less straightforward. That's your lungs and also everything up here that takes the air down into the lungs. We have the digestive system that you're very familiar with. Urinary system that we talked about before. You might see this also called the renal system. Urinary and renal system are exactly the same, just different words. And this is where we get to the controversy between 11 and 12 organ systems. Our book considers the male reproductive system separate from the female reproductive system, and other textbooks just group them into the reproductive system. And so our book says they're separate. And so for us this semester, we will consider them to be separate. This table, I'm not going to go through it. This is more for your study guide or whatever, however you want to use it. But it lists the different organ systems, says which organs are in which organ system and what the primary function is. For this lecture, I would suggest that you know what major organs are in the organ system and what the primary function of the organ systems are. The primary functions are easy. You already know most of them. For the major organs, I could do a question either way. I could say, which organ system is the brain in? And you would say the nervous system. Or I could ask you, give me an organ in the muscular system. Now, you don't need to know all the organs, because if I were to say, name an organ in the digestive system, you know the stomach is there, and so you don't have to worry about the more tic-tac ones like the gallbladder and the pancreas. And if I were to give you an organ and ask you which organ system it was, I would pick an easier organ. I wouldn't ask you which organ system is the thymus in. I would ask you which one is the lymph nodes in. And I would hope that you realize that lymph nodes are in the lymphatic system. Okay, so what's the answer to this one?
D.
Yes, D, the muscular system. Can anyone think of another organ system that is not one of the possible answers that could also be a correct answer to this? Yes, Savannah said skeletal. Yes, muscles don't do us any good if we have no bones, right? Imagine I took the femur out of my leg and I tried to walk. I'm not going to move, right? And so one has to have the other. But the skeletal system alone is not going to move without the muscular system. The next thing we need to talk about is homeostasis. And this is a term you may have heard of before, but I'm guessing a lot of you probably have not. Homeostasis is a process. Okay? It is not a condition. It is a process of maintaining a constant condition. Our body evolved to thrive under a certain set of conditions. We have a body temperature that we are supposed to keep. We have a pH that we are supposed to keep. We have a salt concentration that we are supposed to keep. So the homeostasis is the process of keeping those normal conditions. And so if we start to get away from normal, homeostasis is going to bring us back to normal. If we go too far from normal, we will die. If we get too hot, we will die. Heat stroke. If we get too cold, we will die. Hypothermia, right? And so we have processes to get us back to a normal temperature. And you probably are already seeing what those processes are, but we'll talk about them in a slide or two. We have two organ systems that are primarily responsible for maintaining homeostasis. That is the nervous system and the endocrine system. The reason these two are important is because these are our two signaling systems. The nervous system is going to send electrical signals, and the endocrine system is going to send chemical signals. They are going to tell the other organ systems to change what they're doing to get us back to normal ranges. And so when we talk about homeostasis, we talk about feedback mechanisms. And a feedback mechanism has three distinct parts. There is a receptor. This could also be, you could think of it as a sensor. It is going to detect that we are changing, and we're going to send it back to a control center. Okay? Think of this like a thermometer. Okay? The thermometer just measures what the temperature is. It doesn't tell you, is this a bad temperature? Is this a good temperature? All it does is tell you the temperature. You then have to have a control center that interprets the signal from the receptor to say, is this a good temperature or is this a bad temperature? And then you are going to have an effector that is going to try to get us back to a normal temperature. So before we go to the next slide and start talking about a body, to me, an easy way to think about this is a house. The temperature in our house, we try to keep within a fairly small range, right? So let's say we want to keep the temperature in our house at 78 degrees Fahrenheit. What in our house is going to measure what the temperature is in our house? Anybody? What in our house measures the temperature in our house?
Thermostat.
Yeah, the thermostat. We have the thermostat on the wall that is going to tell us what the temperature is. Now, you may not know what's inside of that thermostat, but there's actually two parts. There is a thermometer, and then there is a little computer chip. And that computer chip is the control center. And so there's the receptor saying, is it 78, is it 79, is it 77? And then the control center saying, well, if I'm at 78, I don't need to do anything. If the temperature goes down to 77, it says, that's too low. I need to change this. And so it's going to send a signal to an effector to bring the temperature back up. What is the effector going to be? Yes, the heater or the furnace, whatever it is, it's going to bring the temperature in the room back up. The thermostat, the thermometer in the thermostat, the receptor or the sensor, is going to detect that we went back up to 78. The control center is going to say, I'm back to a good temperature. Furnace, shut off. And the furnace will shut off. Now, we're in Florida. And so, more often than not, the temperature in the house is going up, not down. And so if the temperature goes up to 79, what is the control center going to do? Yes, it's going to turn on the air conditioner. And so the air conditioner is going to take heat out of the house, blow in cold air, bring the temperature from 79 down to 78. The receptor will sense that, tell the control center. The control center says, I don't need the air conditioner to run anymore. Air conditioner, turn off. Okay. Does that make sense in that format, in that kind of metaphor?
Yes, sir.
Okay. those were both examples of a negative feedback. We had a change, and then we did something to undo the change. That is negative feedback. In our body, an example of negative feedback is controlling our body temperature. If we get too hot, we do something to cool our body off. If we get too cold, we do something to warm our body up. If we eat a meal, our blood sugar goes up. We don't want it to be up. We want it at a normal level. And so our pancreas is going to secrete insulin to bring our blood sugar back down. If our blood pressure goes up, we are going to do something to bring it back down. If it goes down, we're going to do something to bring it back up. Most systems in the body are negative feedback systems, because the purpose of a negative feedback system is to maintain a normal level. The purpose of a positive feedback loop is to get as far from normal as possible. And in most situations, that is not compatible with life. If our blood pressure goes up, we don't want the blood pressure to continue to get higher and higher and higher and higher, right? So there's only a few examples of positive feedback in our body. These are labor contractions, and we'll see that on, I think it's the next slide, and blood clotting. With blood clotting, when we injure ourselves, we get a small blood clot that happens because it's exposed to the air. That small blood clot, though, causes essentially a chain reaction, which then leads to a large blood clot, which stops our blood from clotting. We need a positive feedback loop there because we need it to happen very, very quickly. If we don't stop that bleeding quickly, we're going to die, right? And if we die, there's no purpose in any of this. So here is an example of a negative feedback loop in our body. And so we still have the sensor, the controller, and the effector. In this situation, our body temperature is going to go up. We have cells in our body, we have nerves in our body that are going to sense that our body temperature went up. Those nerves are going to send signals to the brain, and the brain is going to say, uh-oh, my body temperature is going up. This isn't good. I need to do something to get this back down. So it sends a signal to our sweat glands. The sweat glands release sweat. The sweat brings our body temperature back down to 37. That means that the whole system then shuts off. What would be the negative feedback loop if the body temperature went below 37 degrees? What would happen? How do we counteract a low body temperature? Yes, somebody said shivering. Yeah, so if we get too cold, we start to shiver. When our muscles work, not only do they move things, but they also release heat. And so shivering allows us to stay in place, but our muscles are working, and so we generate heat. Here is the example of a positive feedback loop. So at the beginning of labor, a hormone called oxytocin is released by the brain. Oxytocin causes cervical contractions, which then causes the baby to push against the cervix. And as the baby's head pushes against the cervix, it causes more oxytocin to be released. More oxytocin releases causes uterine contractions, which pushes the baby harder, which releases more oxytocin, which causes pushing harder and harder and harder and harder until the baby is born. Once the baby is born, there is no pressure pushing on the cervix. And so this loop is then broken, which is why this positive feedback loop eventually stops. There has to be something that cuts that loop to prevent a positive feedback loop going for the rest of the life, right? That's just not going to work. Okay, So, questions about feedback loops? Anything? Okay, so let's move on. So the last part of what we need to talk about here are just names of things. And a lot of these names are going to refer to the anatomical position. So that's what you're seeing here. The anatomical position is standing upright with your feet shoulder width apart, arms at the side, and palms facing forward. Anything other than that is not the anatomical position. If your hands are facing backwards, that is not the anatomical position. And so we are going to talk about regions. We're going to talk about directional terms. All of those are in reference to the anatomical position. We can take that anatomical position and we can cut it. Whether it be a physical cut like a surgeon or an imaginary cut like someone taking an X-ray or an MRI. We have three types of cuts. We call these cuts planes. We have a sagittal plane, a frontal plane, and a transverse plane. A sagittal plane goes this way. It is going to cut a person into left and right halves. Okay? Actually, let me take that back. It's going to cut us into left and right pieces. It does not have to be exactly halves. And so if I go right down the middle, it's going to cut into left and right halves. That is what we call a mid-sagittal cut. If I cut off center and I cut here, I'm going to cut into left and right pieces, but they're no longer equal. That is going to be a parasagittal cut. A frontal cut or a frontal plane cuts into front and back. There's no way to cut into equal front and back. We are not symmetrical front to back, and so there is no mid-frontal and parafrontal. There's just frontal. You may see frontal planes also called coronal planes. It's the same thing, same word. And then there is a transverse plane. A transverse plane goes this way. It cuts into top and bottom. And again, there's no way to cut equally to top and bottom, and so there's just a transverse plane. If I cut right here, that is a transverse plane. If I cut here, it's a transverse plane. If I cut through my knees, that is a transverse plane. So here we see these. We have a frontal plane cutting in the front and back. We have a transverse plane cutting in the top and bottom, and sagittal plane cutting into left and right. Next, we have directional terms. And so these directional terms are going to come up also in lab. Because they are in your lecture slides, that means you need to know them for the lecture exam also. If you see material that is only in the lab but not in the lecture, you have to know it for the lab exam but not the lecture exam. But when you see something in both, that means you have to know it for both. Now these directional terms almost always come in pairs. And one thing that people struggle with these directional terms is they're always in relation to another thing. Okay? Think of it like higher and lower. You can't say the head is higher. Well, higher than what? Right? And so when you use these directional terms, they're always in reference to another thing. And you'll see this as we go through them. So the first pair we're going to talk about is anterior and ventral. Anterior is, strike that out. Anterior and posterior. Okay? Anterior and posterior are a pair. Anterior is towards the front of the body, posterior is to the back. To make it more complicated, though, some people use different terms. Ventral is exactly the same as anterior. Ventral means towards the front. Dorsal means towards the back. Now, unfortunately, at least for me, in both of these pairs, one of them makes sense and the other one is not logical. So anterior and posterior, you probably realize that posterior is back. Ventral and dorsal, one of these makes sense to me. Can anybody look at that pair and say which one of these looks like a word that I know that would tell me which direction that was?
Dorsal.
Why is dorsal familiar?
Because of a dorsal fin.
Yes, the dorsal fin on a whale, on a dolphin, on a fish is on the back. And so if you remember, the dorsal fin is on the back. I mean, if we had a dorsal fin, it would be back here. And so that's how that is. I know this is probably going to sound strange. That is literally how I remember it. Ventral, I guess that's front, but the way my mind works it is dorsal is the back, so ventral must be front. Process of elimination. Next is cephalic and caudal. This starts to get a little more complicated. Now, cephalic means closer to the head, and caudal means closer to the butt. On a human, this is more or less up and down. But we use the same terms for other animals that walk horizontal. And so on a cat or a dog, cephalic would be towards the front and caudal would be towards the back. For us, cephalic is towards the top and caudal is towards the bottom. Can anybody look at these words and say which one looks familiar and is going to help you remember which one is which? Anybody? So somebody says cephalic. And so you may realize that CEPH refers to head. Okay? And so if you have some medical background, you may realize that. Does anybody recognize caudal? So the caudal fin, we said the dorsal fin was on the back. The caudal fin on a whale, on a dolphin, on a fish is the tail. And so on a cat or a dog, caudal is going to be towards the tail. Now, you may not like to think about it, but we do have a tail, right? It is just really small. It's the tailbone. And so the tailbone is in your butt. And so the caudal direction is towards your butt. Next are superior and inferior. Now, this does not refer to quality. This is not saying that UF is superior to FSU and that FSU is inferior to UF. That's not what we're talking about here. We are talking about higher and lower. And be careful, this only refers to the anatomical position. So you have to assume that the patient is standing up. Even if the patient is laying down, the head is superior to the chest. Okay? Even though if they're laying down, they may be even to each other. Superior means towards the top. Inferior means lower. Medial means closer to the middle. Lateral means further from the middle. Can somebody give me an example? Say a sentence. This body part is medial to this body part.
The nose is medial to the face.
For the face is a general area. And so pick another spot on the face.
The eye.
Yes. The nose is closer to the midline than the eye. So you can turn that statement around and say that the eye is lateral to the nose.
Okay.
Somebody give me an example of using superior and inferior. So superior was higher, inferior was lower. Yes, somebody said the head is superior to the neck. And so reverse it, the neck is inferior to the head. Now notice, like I said, this is all in reference to another thing. You can't say the head is superior or the neck is inferior. You just can't do that. It's always in reference to another thing. Let's see. Yeah, so we go on to another slide. The next is proximal and distal. Now, proximal and distal get confused with superior and inferior. For superior and inferior, we can only use those terms when we're talking about things on our trunk. Our trunk is our head down to the base of our spine, our pelvis area. Our trunk does not include our arms or our legs. If we talk about arms or legs, we cannot use superior or inferior because they're designed to move up and down freely, right? If I do this, would seemingly be inferior to this. But as soon as I do that, it flips. And so we need to be more consistent than that. And so we use proximal and distal. Proximal means closer to the trunk, closer to the connection point. If you're talking about something on your hand and arm, it's closer to the shoulder. Distal means further from the shoulder or further from the hip, closer to the feet. And so, for example, my foot is distal to my knee. My hip is proximal to my knee or my ankle. The way I remember this, distal sounds like distant, right? So distal means more distant from the connection point. Then we have ipsilateral and contralateral. This means on the same side of the body or on different sides of the body. Left versus right only. You cannot use these terms for top, bottom, or front or back. It is left, right only. So ipsilateral means the two things you're talking about are on the same side. Contralateral means they're on the opposite sides. Think contradictory. Those are if something is contradictory, it is different. So contralateral means on different sides. And so imagine a physician talking about two fingers. They're talking about a finger, the index finger, and the ipsilateral middle finger. That means it is these two fingers on the same hand. If they're talking about the index finger on one hand and the middle finger on the other, they would say the index finger, one of the index fingers, and the contralateral middle finger. That way, imagine you're going into surgery and they're going to amputate two fingers. You want to make sure that the surgeon knows which ones to do and they don't accidentally cut off a good finger. And the final directional terms are superficial and deep. Now these might be the most complicated. They're not complicated, they're just the hardest to imagine. If you boil it down, superficial means closer to the skin and deep is further from the skin. Now think about my arm though. There can be something that's closer to the skin here. If I talk about the muscle compared to the bone, that muscle is superficial to the bone. The skin is superficial to the muscle. On the top of my arm, the skin is on top, then the muscle is below it. But on the bottom of my arm, everything is reversed. Even though the skin is on the bottom, it is still superficial to the muscle on the bottom of my arm. Okay, so superficial means towards the outside, and deep means towards the inside. In whatever scenario you're using these terms in, you have to think about it and say, is that up? Is that down? Is that left? Is that right? Just think about it. And so this is a diagram showing those terms we were talking about. We're not going to go through it. This is for study purposes. And we'll also see basically the same diagram in the lab. Next is body regions. Okay, we have a lot of regions. Regions are just general areas of the body. Somebody before mentioned the face. The face is a region. It's an area. It is not a specific point. And so on this diagram, we see the facial region. And the facial region is part of the skull region. They're general areas, not specific points. Let me check. I just want to look at this slide. Okay. So on this slide, we are looking at two ways of looking at the skeleton. We have the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. On here is a whole bunch of bones. You do not need to know those yet. That is not the purpose of this diagram. The purpose of this diagram is to look at the two slightly different colored bones. I don't know who thought this was a great idea to use two colors that are almost identical. But this more bluish color gray is the appendicular skeleton. It makes up the appendages. The axial skeleton is the slightly less blue gray that makes up our trunk. Okay, so those are two body regions. And then looking from the outside, we have a whole bunch more. We are not going to go through all of these. When you go through the lab, they give you a diagram and you have to fill that diagram out. You are responsible for knowing the body regions that are in the lab for both the lab and the lecture. It is not all of them on this diagram you're looking at here now. And so for the lab and the lecture, you need to know the ones that are on that lab diagram. For example, if we look at the cervical region, that is the neck. The antecubital region is this. You'll see in the lab video. Actually, let me clarify this. I am not a clinician. I have a science background. And so scientists use words that describe things rather than Latin words. And so to me, what makes sense, what I would have named this is the elbow pit. If this is the armpit, that's the elbow pit, right? That is not a technical term. Please do not use that in any class other than this one. And even in this one, that is not a valid answer for any exam question. But that's just an example of a region. This area here is the antecubital region. So again, you need to know the ones in the lab. Next, we have the abdominal cavity. So this is everything from your diaphragm, which is the base of your... I'm trying to show you my diaphragm, but you can't see it right now. So that's the base of your lungs down to your pelvis. And we break it up into quadrants. That's what you're seeing here. Quadrants, we have 4 parts. Upper and lower is easy. Look at that diagram and look at what is labeled right and what is labeled left, and immediately recognize that they are backwards. And that means that a lot of you are going to get it wrong on the exam. It is not your left and your right. It is the patient's left and the patient's right. And so that means if you look at a diagram and that diagram is showing a front view, everything is flipped. If you're looking at a diagram and you're looking at the abdominal area from the back, it's going to be normal, right? So you have to think about it. What is the patient's left? What is the patient's right? The lab is going to require you to know what organs are in which quadrant. Now, any question that asks you about this is going to make it an easy question, okay? I mean, you can see that some organs go into multiple quadrants. And so you don't need to know that the small intestine is in the left upper, the left lower, and the right lower, and not in the right upper. Okay, that's just not a question that I would ask you to know. I would expect you to know that it's more or less in the lower quadrants, right? And for the liver here, I would expect you to know that it's primarily in the right upper quadrant. I wouldn't expect you to know that there's any of it in the left upper. And if I asked you a question about what quadrant something was in, I would ask you an obvious organ. I am not going to ask you what quadrant your gallbladder is in, okay? That's just not something I care about whether you know, because we're not going to learn about the gallbladder in this course. Your 2086 professor is going to care whether you know where the gallbladder is. And so I'm going to give you an organ that is easy to cover. Next are body cavities. These are empty areas in our body, usually occupied by organs. Now notice there's a lot of words on this diagram. We have a lot of different levels of organization when we talk about body cavities. The highest, most general level of organization is we have the dorsal body cavity, which is on the left here, and the ventral body cavity, which is on the right. The dorsal body cavity contains your brain and your spinal cord, period. Nothing else. And the dorsal body cavity is made up of two smaller cavities. The cranial cavity, which is where the brain is, and the vertebral cavity, which is where the spinal cord is. Then we move to the ventral body cavity. That is everything down in here, right? You've seen pictures, you've dissected other animals, whatever. You know that there's just a bunch of empty space here and organs in it. That is the ventral body cavity. And then within the ventral body cavity, we have the upper part and we have the lower part. The upper part is the thoracic cavity. That is the diaphragm up. Below the diaphragm is the abdominal pelvic cavity. The thoracic cavity has even more subparts. There is the superior mediastinum. Our lab just calls it the mediastinum. That is this little area between the lungs and above the heart. We have the pleural cavity, which is where the lungs are located. And then we have the pericardial cavity, which is where the heart is located. Below the diaphragm, we said we had the abdominal pelvic cavity, and whoever named this one is now my friend because they named it logically. The abdominal pelvic cavity contains the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. I wish they would have named the thoracic cavity something like the medial pleural cardial cavity, something like that. But they didn't. And so it's the thoracic cavity, and then it has three subcavities whose names have absolutely nothing to do with thoracic. And so I expect you to know all of the cavities on here. Everything on this diagram you will need to know both for lecture and lab. The very last thing, I think it's the last thing, don't quote me on that, but the last thing we need to talk about are the serous membranes. Now you probably have no idea what these are. You probably never heard about them. What they do is they are lubrication around our organs that allow organs to move around a little bit without bumping into each other, and allow them to slide across each other without creating friction. Okay, and we're going to see what these look like in a slide or two. But we have three serous membranes in our body. We have the pericardium. This is a serous membrane around our heart. We have the pleura, or the pleural membrane, which goes around our lungs. Notice these words sound like the cavities, right? The pericardial cavity had the heart. The pericardium is the membrane around the heart. The pleural cavity contains the lungs. The pleura go around the lungs. Now, around the abdominal organs has a completely new name, the peritoneum. This is a serous membrane that goes around your intestines and everything else down in your abdomen. So this is what the serous membranes look like. This particular diagram uses a balloon filled with air. And I don't know why they used an air balloon when water balloons exist and serous membranes are filled with water. I really don't know what they were thinking. But on this diagram, think of this as a water balloon. Okay? If you take a water balloon and you push your fist down into it, that water balloon is going to form around that fist. That is the exact same form that these serous membranes take around the organs. On the left, you see the heart surrounded by the pericardium. Now we've labeled some parts of the pericardium here. We have the visceral pericardium and the parietal pericardium. The visceral pericardium is the part of the membrane that touches the organ. The parietal pericardium is the part of the membrane that is away from the organ, right? And so if you push your fist into the water balloon, the visceral part is the part that's touching your fist, and the parietal part is whatever part of the water balloon that is not touching your fist. And then located inside of the serous membrane is serous fluid, which is basically just salt water. That's basically all it is. It's just salt water. So here is, I think, our last little review question. So what is the answer to this one? So I'm getting D.
B.
Yeah. So the visceral part of the serous membrane refers to the part of the membrane that touches the organ. And so visceral refers to internal organs. And the parietal serous membrane is the part that faces away from the organ. And so it's going to be out into the cavity that the organ sits in. And so this is just a general something that you can think about throughout the semester. Visceral is always going to refer to internal organs, and parietal is always going to mean outside. Okay, so that is the end of our first lecture. Are there any questions about any of that or about the course as a whole?
No, sir.
Anything? Anybody?
No, sir.
Oh, okay.
In the book, they talk about like imaging and other things past what you've gone over. Is that worth reviewing?
No. So the question was, in the book they talk about imaging, and so the only way I would expect you to be able to relate imaging to this is the planes that we talked about. So if you're looking at a picture of a brain and you realize it's cut this way through with an MRI or a CAT scan, you have to realize which plane that was. But I don't expect you to know anything about imaging itself. Okay. And so again, if it's in the book, and it seems like the book goes more into more detail than I went over in the lecture, I don't require you to know that.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Can you go back over the superficial and deep
Yeah.
on the directional terms?
Yeah.
I was kind of confused on that.
It is. It is. So the question was, can I go back over the superficial and deep? So this is the one I said you in every situation you have to think about it. You can't just quick say which is superficial and what is deep. You have to think about the situation you're dealing with. Superficial always means closer to the skin or closer to the outside world. And deep means further from the skin or further from the outside world. And so you could say that my ribs are superficial to my heart, right? Because the heart is closer to the middle of my body and my ribs are closer to the very outside of my body. Turn it around, you would say that my heart is deep compared to my ribs. Where it starts to get more complicated is when you get into your appendages, where you have a top and a bottom. Like I said, on my arm, on the top of my arm like this, superficial is up. But on the bottom of my arm, superficial is down. And so you really have to think about it. When you look at a diagram, if you look at a diagram of skin, just out of convention, they always put the outside up. Now, that doesn't mean you can't take that diagram, turn it upside down, and think about the skin on the bottom of my arm. So usually on a diagram, superficial is always going to be up, and deep is always going to be down. But that doesn't mean that on a person it actually is. I wish I could give a better definition of that, but does that get you close enough that you think you can work your way through it?
Yeah, that definitely helped a lot more. Thank you.
Okay. And I'm seeing a chat question asking if the lecture will be posted so that you can rewatch it. And the answer is yes. And so I am having Zoom record this. I will give you a link to watch the Zoom recording. People in this class can see who is in the class. And so I think it's helpful for you to be able to see the other people and to hear them. And so you will have a link to all of what's going on, right? But my other recording I'll use in future semesters so that they can't see you or hear you or anything like that. But once I get this video, I am going to figure out how to send it to you, and I'll send you a message. I can't see how it actually works until I have the video, but I'll probably tonight, tomorrow at the latest, I'll send a Canvas message showing you how to access the video. The other question was review receptor and effector. So this is in the feedback loops and the homeostasis. So let me go back. So every feedback loop, and feedback loops maintain homeostasis, or in case of a positive feedback loop, purposely take us away from homeostasis. We have the three parts. We have a receptor, a control center, and an effector. A receptor is dumb. It doesn't know why it's doing what it's doing, and it can't interpret what it measures. All it does is it measures something and sends that signal to something that's smarter than it. And that smarter thing is the control center. The control center in us is going to be our brain or our spinal cord. It interprets the signal coming from the receptor and decides what, if anything, needs to be done. And if something needs to be done, it then sends a signal to the effector. And that has the effector do something. The effector is also dumb. It doesn't know why it's doing what it's doing. It just received an order to do it, and so it is doing it. But the effector is the thing that actually causes the change. It is the furnace that heats the house. It is the air conditioner that cools the house. It's the sweat gland that cools our body. It's the muscles that cause us to shiver and heat up our body. It is whatever causes the change. So for the person that asked that, does that make sense? So it says, okay, so effector just follows order. I'm not sure what you mean by order. the system always goes in this order. It goes receptor sends a signal to, yeah. So this is hot or cold. I'm still not following.
I think she means, so does the effector follow the orders that the control center
Yes. It follows the orders. The control center sends orders. Thank you. Whoever clarified that for me, thank you. The control center sends orders to the effector, and then the effector just follows orders, whatever those orders may be. Okay. So did that make sense? Okay. And then there was a question up ahead asked about, is it more important to focus on the slides or the book? Definitely the slides. Look at the slides, watch the lecture, use the textbook as supplemental material. It is possible to get 100% in this class without ever looking at the book. Now that doesn't mean that's a good way of going about it. But if just use the textbook as another way of another explanation, putting it something that puts it into different words than I did. Maybe they will use different words that make more sense than what I did. But what you don't want to do is try to learn everything in the book for an exam, because if you try to learn 100% of it and you only need to know 50% of it, you're not going to know the important 50% well enough. And so in terms of general knowledge, it's great if you learn all of it, but I know you all care about your grade more than general knowledge, and so in terms of a grade, focus solely on the lecture. What else? Okay. If you do come up with any more questions, somebody asked about attendance. It is not required. I suggest that you come to the live lecture, but it is recorded. I'm not writing down who of you is here. That does not factor into your grade at all. Just remember, if you don't come and something happens with the recording, you're just going to have to look at the slides itself in the book and try to figure out how it works. Now, granted, that is how a normal online class works, and so it is possible. Students do it all the time. It's just not perfect. Anything else? If you do come up with questions, send me a Canvas message. That's always the preferred way to do it. Otherwise, email me. I will see you next Tuesday at 6 o'clock. My suggestion is to tomorrow or even tonight do the homework that goes with this lecture, and then sometime this week before next week's lecture, do the lab that is associated with this lecture. Do it all at once while it's fresh in your mind. You can put it all together, and it might help you learn the other thing. You may see something in the lab that helps you make sense of the lecture. Something in the lecture might help you make sense of the lab. And don't forget about the videos that go with the lab. Okay. Anything else? If not, I will...
Sorry, one more question.
Yes, go ahead.
When I was first logging in, it was making me use the Santa Fe College email. Is that always going to be the case? I don't know why, but then it started letting me go in with my normal Zoom account.
So I believe I set... So that's I'm fairly new to Zoom. Yeah. I believe that is a setting that I purposely chose. I think it made you authenticate, which means using the Santa Fe email address. There are problems where you've all seen the whole Zoom bomb thing, right? Where random people come in, and if they just start making jokes, that's fine, but they start doing very inappropriate things. And so we have to use a password to keep them out. But even with a password, that password can get shared. And unfortunately, the Zoom passwords are not all that complicated. And so people who figure out the pattern to find a Zoom link can also fairly easily find the Zoom password. And so this requires you to log into the Santa Fe email address and have the password. And so that way it keeps all the bad people out. If that continues to be a problem, though, I think that's a setting I can change.
Yeah, I noticed noticed that I was supposed to, I guess I had to create an account, but then for some reason I tried it again and it let me in with my normal Zoom account. So I'm not really sure what happened, but
Okay.
anyway.
Is there
I think I emailed you about it.
okay? Is there anyone that created a Santa Fe account as it asked and got in? That may be a no. And so I think what I'll do is I'll just try to get rid of that setting. And if we have a problem, we have a problem. I doubt we will. And so it's more important to make sure that the students get in than making sure nobody else gets in. So I'll try to change that setting.
Thank you.
Okay. If there's nothing else, I'm going to sign off and I'll let you know as soon as I get this video ready for you. Okay. Have a good night.
Thank you.
You too.